Thank you for joining us for an episode of Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark. Today, our guest is Zina Navarro Rodriguez. Zina is the co-founder and CEO of Z&D Consulting, a global mental wellness advocate and diversity, equity, and inclusion executive. Zina is joining us today to discuss the need for diversity and leadership in clinical positions and how creating a safe and welcoming space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and folks within the LGBTQ+ community can lead to impactful change. Zina, we're so delighted that you are joining us today. I'm going to now pass on over to Diana.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, Zina. It's so good to have you on this program today. And I have wanted to talk to you about your diversity work for a very long time. So now I get to pummel you with questions of all the ways I've been curious. So starting with, what is the landscape? What are we dealing with now? Who are clinicians and who are clients and why? How's that?
I love it. I'm so happy to be here. First of all, I've known you and OPG since its inception, and really an honor to be part of having this conversation, very important conversation with you all today. That is an amazing question that you're going to lead in with, because the landscape is this. Our field is white. Our clients are white. In the for-profit, even the nonprofit world of the private care sector, we are a white dominant culture. And kind of
female too, by and large, would you say white female? Or
absolutely.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, definitely. I'm a social worker. So in my social work program, I would say about 95% of the student body in my cohort was white female. And I went to a pretty diverse school. I went to Rutgers in New Brunswick, but the dominant, it doesn't matter. So, that's a whole other conversation about, institutions and the structures behind it, because inherent even in doing good work, what we don't realize is we're only looking at it through one lens, and it's a white lens. And even when you want to do good work, there's something missing when you don't have the lived experiences sharing in that education process and that foundational education process, and then in really the delivery of direct care services, right? So, I mean, for me, that's the landscape. And, we could go from there, but the landscape is, we are primarily a white, owned, operated, led field with very few clients of color, unless you're working in certain sectors. But that in itself is a problem. So we're here to change it. That's what this discussion's about.
Right. I mean, and also, as much as there is availability for other socio-demographic people to get access to mental health care, let's face it, mental health care was originally designed for white privileged people.
Yeah. Yeah,
it was.
definitely. Yeah.
So they were the people who could afford the luxury of thinking about that.
Absolutely. And there are cultural reasons why there are still barriers to treatment for certain communities. There's a lack of understanding about mental health and stigmas around it. Absolutely. But for me, from my privileged position of having been educated in the field, having been working in the field now for as long as I have, I feel it's our responsibility to be intentional about educating these communities, as well as partnering with them, right? They're stakeholders in their lives. So it's like they may have their own cultural needs and ways of responding to care that they are the authorities of, and not the experts in the room. So, there's so much work that needs to be done. I think I'm literally scratching the surface since I've started doing this work. And these conversations have just been like this, because none of us are really sure of all the right ways to do things. But I think it has to start with intention. And I think, like this conversation here, it's about being intentional about, at least we recognize it. We've got to create awareness around it. And once we do this, then we go into next steps. And so what do we need to do for communities, and who do we need to involve in the conversation? And do we want them? Do we want to change our systems? I think that's another introspective thing that has to happen.
And don't we even need to start with the definition of mental health, or what is considered healthy, when we're dealing in a different cultural realm? I mean, for me, launching in my family of origin meant at 18, you went off to college and you launched. That
Right.
was the definition of a healthy adulthood. That is not universal, is it?
Absolutely not. I mean, mine was if I turned 18 and I got a paying job, or I married someone who had a good job and we raised kids right away, then that was it. That wasn't, it depends on, I grew up in the inner city. So I had a completely different trajectory and kind of expectation. Like, number one, if you survived without going to jail, if you survived without being pregnant at 15, if then you were kind of a success. So, there's so many complexities and intersections depending on where you grow up and how you grow up. And I grew up, from a substance abuse mental health. I grew up during the crack epidemic, so these are kind of the institutional structures that I think the broader world doesn't understand, is that we had, like, it was almost like, here's this great drug for your community and no resources for it, right? But what we will do is we'll criminalize it. We know you may be poor. And so when people are poor, they're depressed, they have anxiety, they don't know what to do with themselves. Smoking a crack pipe sounds pretty good, right? So we're going to make that readily available to your community. So there's all these implications on that.
Yeah, we're going to make it cheap and we're going to make it highly addictive, and it's going to solve that underlying, nugget of anger and displacement.
Yeah, and break up families, just like substance abuse would affect even a high functioning, high net worth family. There's no difference in how it systemically affects a family. But then when you put it in, when these types of issues are being treated, or what the word is, it's like this is what's readily available for your depression and anxiety. Hey, we're just going to keep this drug, in your neighborhoods. But it's just, what are the implications of all that in terms of how we view mental health, and who is the recipient of mental health, and how should they receive services for either mental health, substance abuse? To me, it's the same apple, honestly.
Have you seen a model that has been, inclusive? Have you seen it happen yet?
No.
Even a nugget? No.
No, honestly, I don't. I think people are struggling with even just having these type of conversations on just the foundational pieces. I just came from doing an 8-hour training with an executive team in the South. And it was an all white, mostly male team. If I think about everybody in the room was predominantly male. And they were really they went at this with this like real good intention, that they kind of want to do better. They know that they're in a community where they can serve more people of color. They have some clinical staff that are of color, who have been kind of like the ones that have been spearheading, like, we need to do more. And so they said they really wanted to get intentional about creating diversity within their own organization. What I found, though, within the training is that when you speak to the structural systems, and this is the big dirty word everybody gets uncomfortable with, when you say your institutions are racist, right? Racism and white supremacy are dominating why your room with this executive leadership team is only white people. It's a systemic structural issue. So it doesn't mean, and one of the participants said, I feel like you're telling us we're the KKK when you use words like white supremacy. And it's like, let's dial it back. It's uncomfortable, but your structure is built on keeping you in the position you're in and keeping everyone else in the position you're in. So it was a really, it gets uncomfortable for folks to have this kind of dialogue. And, I walked away not sure if they were more hurt, but I can't, because they kind of like, we're doing this for a good reason. And, we're not white supremacists, but your system is, it is. And you have to admit that. And our field is. When you look at websites, when you look at leadership teams, when we're at networking events, who's at the table? I'll be like usually the only other. That is an institutional thing. That's a structural institutional thing we need to change. And we've just got to be honest about it. We can't change it if we can't speak it.
So you're talking on a systemic organizational level, but on a personal level, don't we also have to evaluate or at least assess our own pockets of racism? Whether we be
Absolutely.
Black, white, people of color, it doesn't matter. We all are
Absolutely.
tribal. Right.
I did the Harvard implicit bias test about a year ago, and it was really interesting to see where my own biases were held and my blind spots are. And that's why this whole term of cultural competency is like such, it's really like a mislabeled term. We'll never be competent. None of us will never be cultural competent. But is there a willingness to continue learning? Is there a willingness to continue intentionally trying to be more inclusive and learning about other lived experiences? And I think that's exactly where it needs to happen. It's really on the interpersonal level where it
And
starts.
asking the questions, what is healthy for you? What are your goals? My goals may or may not be appropriate for the way you live. To start with those questions and at
Yeah.
least be, we're not going to be culturally competent. We're going to be culturally ignorant, but we could be culturally ignorant and open.
Yes, and I think that's appreciated. So like if we're talking about a direct care clinical setting, right? That's kind of the scenario you just played out. I've been in therapy for probably the good part of my adult life, right? You become, that's one of the things when you go into the work, if you're going to do it well, you should be in therapy. I never had a therapist of color, right? And so I've had great therapists, wonderful therapists. But the last couple of years, with kind of everything that was going on in the world, I felt like with my therapist, I couldn't have the same conversation that I really wanted to, that I would have with my peers or my family members, because I felt like there was a comfort level, like I'm going to say something about like Black people and it's going to make her uncomfortable. And I didn't know how readily she could accept it. So it just, and it wasn't because she wasn't a wonderful therapist, because she was. I wanted to really be free in what I needed to say. And she never asked questions like throughout, there's all this racial injustice things going on. And it was never kind of an intentional question like, so how are you feeling about what's going on? It's almost like it was
you personally.
Right.
What are your thoughts when you lie in bed at night and you hear this going on?
Exactly. So, I became really intentional about finding a clinician of color, which in of itself was very difficult. They're waitlisted now, but there's so few of them and there's such a huge demand now. But that says something to the field from the business side of it. There's a need out there we're not meeting, right? And we need more representation, and people need to feel that they can be received by other clinicians, by other facilities, that their lived experience is validated. And I think that's what you were kind of speaking to when you described that scenario. And I don't think everyone's ready to do that,
No,
And
it is shaking up the status quo, and that is scary to most people, right?
for
If
sure.
we genuinely acknowledge as the white privilege that we were lucky and we were born this way, we didn't earn it, we were born on top and trying to live it down, and that is not necessarily true for a huge chunk of the population or the people who will present in our offices, and to be open about their experience is really, really important.
Yeah, it is. But, there's a huge part of our field that doesn't feel that way, that doesn't see white privilege in that way. And I've seen it with some of my own cohorts in the field and folks that I've known for many years, that you can't have that white privilege conversation because they don't believe in it. There's this Americanism ideal that everyone can make it and everyone can succeed, and people don't see the barriers that happen. And I am not saying there, from a socioeconomic place, of course, there are white communities where there are equally difficult barriers. There's a whole other barrier that exists when you have a tint of color, a different last name, a religion that's not part of the dominant religion, a sexual identity that's not part of the dominant culture. That in itself brings much more difficult barriers for folks, and it's not a level playing field. And people have a hard time believing that. And I've had conversations with, a couple of my cohorts about this, and they really struggle with it. They don't believe in that concept. And it's been hard for me, to say, you're a behavioral healthcare provider. Like this is so,
Right. You don't want to
you
go
should
down
be.
the Saturday Night Live, you ignorant slut, but you do, there is how do you look around yourself, see
Yeah,
it and not see it?
yeah,
That is
definitely.
also the privilege, white privilege, to not see it.
That is definitely a huge part of it, you know. And so when you're a person of color and you're navigating this, I've had wonderful positions, I've been executive director of, major behavioral healthcare company. And that may have looked like diversity, but it surely was not equity. Like, I did not have an equal voice at the table as some of my cohorts and peers. And that's just the reality. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But this is kind of, why I'm doing the work that I'm doing now. It's got to change, because we're changing. We're a multicultural society. By 2044, there's not going to be one white dominant anyone. Not, the Spanish are the fastest growing, the Latino, Hispanic are fastest growing, but we'll still be just a percentage. Whites will be another percentage. So it's like, we're going to be in this very multicultural world where there's going to be a need for mental health treatment for all of us. Let's make it equitable.
So let's get to nuts and bolts. What are you doing? What exactly are you doing so that you can say there are things, we can have this conversation, but there are positive steps we can all take? What are you doing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we started to initiate it. What I did intentionally last year was I realized I was living abroad in Thailand and kind of watching the US from this like outer worldly experience. And as a person of color, who's worked in the field for many, many years, and I said, there's got to be a way to do better. So diversity, equity, and inclusion work has been part of, larger, bigger corporate companies have been involved in doing this. And our field is like 20 years behind on doing any kind of equity work. And so I saw the need, and for me, it was a personal passion, um, because it aligned with both my personal and professional experience. I had a family member that when they needed treatment, I had a very difficult time thinking about what would be the right fit for them, because they would be in a very white dominant facility, with maybe not clinicians that would understand some of the racial and other needs that they had. So for me, it was a big aha moment. So I decided to get certified in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because I wanted to work with leadership. To me, I'm a really macro social worker. You have to start at the top. Like, you have to, the bigger organizational pieces have to feed down to the rest of the company. And I'm not a big hierarchical person, but I think when we have big system changes that need to be made, it has to start at a macro level. And what we're finding in this work, it's really starting from micro. In a lot of organizations that I'm talking to, there'll be clinicians of color or LGBTQ identified clinicians or staff members that are like, hey, my people need help, we need more representation, we need this. And so it's kind of coming in our field. It's been initiated by kind of those staff members, but I think we need to flip that. And what I've been encouraging and slowly been putting the word out is, hey, my leadership folks, you kind of really, number one, need to be self-aware of the fact you're all white. And it's a problem. Like, you can't be, you're not representing communities that are in need, right? And mostly heteropatriarchal too. So it's all white, cisgender, right? So there's a different world out here that needs services. So that's the work I've been doing. And I have a group of psychiatrists and other behavioral health folks that are specialized in know addiction and mental health really well, but are passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I've been partnering with them, and depending on the need of the organization, we go in, we'll do trainings, we'll do audits, assessments. I really like you start with the top. You start with the top and why? Why do you want to do it? Are you sure you want to do it? Because the worst thing you can do as an organization is go into this work, start trying to diversify your staff, trying to open access to treatment, then slapping on a few people of color on your website, but then the delivery, it's not a safe place. The delivery of care is not safe. The environment for your staff is not safe. And what does that mean, right? There's a lot to it. So I do a lot of training around that topic.
Right. I was so impressed. We have, as you know, an employer services division, and we had a team meeting, and I looked at that Zoom screen, and it was minimum 50% people of color. And no trans, but we definitely had some LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
And that makes me feel like we can reach people that we wouldn't otherwise reach.
Absolutely. And that what you described, my hairs are standing because, I was so excited to be part of that call as well. And my heart was just beaming throughout that call, looking at the images on the screen as well. Because this is what America is. That's what all those pictures were. This is who we are. This is a mix of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnicities, different sexual identities. This is who America is. And from a provider standpoint, these are who our clients should be. And they're not right now. And I've worked in residential facilities where there's always only 2 or 3 people of color at a time, if that, at any given time in a facility. So, we need to change that.
Broaden that. All right, we've got one last piece of advice. What would you like to leave this webinar with? What would you like the listeners to get out of this today?
I mean, the biggest thing is stay open and curious. I think it's just a humanity thing. If we do that, if you stay open and curious, you'll reach out to people that normally maybe, and it's okay if you don't have like 10 Black Latina friends. Find one and start talking to them. Like, broaden your own horizons. And I think, when you do that, you start understanding people on a different level, and then you start seeing kind of the different needs because you're looking at it from a different lens. You get to see different experiences than your own.
And hear different cultural strengths because they are different and they are strengths. And
Thank you for saying that.
See them as strengths is hindering mental health.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Zina. This
is Zina
Navarro Rodriguez. She's doing some diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and we are thrilled to have her as our guest today.
Thank you so much, Diana.